Perhaps your majesty should see his bride before he swears himself to her. The woman's whisper was soft enough to pretend it had been private and loud enough to travel through Blackwood Hall. Evelyn Carter felt the room change around her. Hundreds of guests stood beneath silver banners and winter-white roses, but suddenly there was no music, no rustle of formal gowns, no quiet conversation. Only silence. Across from her, Alpha King Alexander Blackwood watched her through the thin ivory veil covering her face. He was 31, tall and composed in a black royal coat edged with silver, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved for authority. Evelyn had expected arrogance. What frightened her was his restraint. He gave nothing away. The officiant shifted nervously. "Your Majesty?" Alexander raised one hand. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her bouquet. She knew what came next. She had known since leaving her family's estate that eventually someone would demand to see the bride the northern court had already mocked in whispers. Alexander stepped closer. His hand reached for the edge of her veil. Evelyn forced herself not to retreat. The fabric lifted slowly. Cool afternoon air touched her face. A woman near the front drew in a sharp breath. Another guest whispered something Evelyn could not make out. She did not need to hear it. She knew what they saw. Dark Moonveil markings curved across her pale left cheek, beginning near her temple and fading toward her jaw. They had followed her through every sunrise since she was 16, turning introductions into stares and crowded rooms into places she learned to endure. Evelyn looked only at Alexander. For one brief second, his control slipped. His gray eyes widened. His jaw tightened. Then the king returned, composed and unreadable. Somehow, that tiny hesitation hurt more than open cruelty. If he had mocked her, she could have despised him. If he had refused the marriage, she could have walked away with what remained of her pride. Instead, Alexander lowered the veil no farther and turned toward the officiant. "Continue the ceremony." 3 words. No insult. No kindness. Evelyn lifted her chin. The vows resumed beneath a silence that felt colder than the snow beyond the castle windows. Alexander spoke every required promise clearly. Evelyn did the same. When she placed her hand in his palm was warm, but his touch remained formal, careful, almost distant. The court applauded when they were declared husband and wife. Evelyn heard none of it clearly. She could only see the western windows beyond Alexander's shoulder. The winter sun was already descending toward the hills, spilling amber light across the marble floor. She calculated the time automatically. Perhaps an hour remained. Maybe less. Alexander followed her gaze. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly. Evelyn looked back at the man who had just married a woman he could barely hide his disappointment in seeing. "No, Your Majesty." She gave him the practiced smile that had protected her for years. "Everything is exactly as I expected." His eyes lingered on her as though the answer troubled him, but Evelyn turned toward the waiting court. She had survived the veil being lifted. Now she needed only to survive until sunset, because when the final light disappeared behind those snowy hills, the bride Alexander believed he had married would disappear with it. The applause followed Evelyn into the banquet chamber, but warmth did not. Blackwood Castle glittered around her with silver chandeliers, polished dark oak, and hundreds of candles reflected in crystal glasses, yet every elegant detail only made her feel more visible. Alexander walked beside her without touching her. He greeted council members, acknowledged visiting pack leaders, and accepted congratulations with the calm precision of a man performing a duty he had rehearsed. Evelyn understood the message. She was his queen before the court. Nothing more had been promised. At the royal table, Alexander pulled out her chair. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." His gray eyes met hers briefly before moving toward the guests. Evelyn sat and folded her hands beneath the table, where no one could see them trembling. Across the room, a blonde woman in a deep blue gown watched her with polished interest. Vanessa Whitmore. Evelyn had heard the name twice. Already, always followed by the same unfinished sentence. Everyone thought she would be the one. Vanessa approached during the second course and offered a graceful smile. "Welcome to Blackwood, Your Majesty. I hope the castle proves comfortable." "I am sure it will." Vanessa's gaze rested for half a second too long on Evelyn's marked cheek. Adjustment can be difficult when one arrives somewhere people have certain expectations. Evelyn smiled gently. Expectations are usually hardest on the people who create them. Vanessa's expression barely changed, but Alexander looked toward Evelyn. She did not look back. A few minutes later, a young servant carrying a silver tray stumbled when a noble stepped unexpectedly into her path. One glass tilted toward the floor. Evelyn caught it before it fell. The servant went pale. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. You have nothing to apologize for." Evelyn steadied the tray until the girl's hands stopped shaking. "What is your name?" "Clara." "Thank you, Clara." The girl blinked as if gratitude were the last response she expected. Evelyn released the tray and returned to her seat. When she looked up, Alexander was watching her. Not the markings. Her. The distinction was small enough to disappear if she examined it too closely, so she let it go. By the time dinner ended, amber daylight had narrowed against the western windows. Evelyn counted every remaining minute. Alexander escorted her through a long corridor lined with portraits of Blackwood rulers until they reached two doors facing each other. "These are your rooms," he said. Evelyn glanced across the hall. "And yours?" "There." His answer confirmed what his distance had already told her. Separate rooms. Separate lives. A marriage maintained for alliance and appearance. "I understand." Something about her calm response seemed to unsettle him. "You will have whatever you need." Evelyn almost asked whether that included dignity, but exhaustion stopped her. "Good night, Alexander." She entered her room and closed the door softly. Then she moved fast. Lock. Curtains. Mirror. The final sunlight was already sliding from the stone walls. Evelyn stood before her reflection as the last golden line vanished beneath the horizon. Warmth spread slowly beneath her skin. The dark Moonveil markings along her cheek began to fade, dissolving until clear pale skin remained beneath the candlelight. Her blue-gray eyes looked brighter. The familiar face she had hidden from the world stared back at her. Evelyn touched her cheek and released the breath she had held all day. Outside her locked room, Blackwood Castle believed its new queen had retired for the night. Inside, the woman Alexander had married no longer looked like the bride he remembered. Evelyn remained before the mirror long after the transformation was complete, studying the face she had almost forgotten belonged to her. There was no pain when the Moonveil released her. That was the strange mercy of it. No flash of magic, no dramatic warning, only warmth beneath her skin and the gradual disappearance of every dark marking that daylight restored. She had been 16 the first morning she awakened with them. Her mother had gone silent. Her father had summoned healers from 3 neighboring territories. None had found an illness, poison, or ordinary spell they could name. Then sunset came, and the markings vanished. By the following sunrise, they had returned. 7 years later, Evelyn had stopped waiting for an explanation. She had learned the rules instead. Daylight brought the Moonveil. Darkness released it. Nothing she did changed that rhythm. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn turned sharply. "Your Majesty?" Clara's voice came through the door. "I brought fresh towels and warm water." Evelyn pulled her robe closer around her shoulders, but did not unlock the door. "Please leave them outside." "Thank you, Clara." There was a pause. "I also wanted to thank you for earlier." Evelyn rested her palm against the wood. "For catching a glass? For not making me feel foolish." Clara's voice softened. "People notice mistakes here." Evelyn understood more than Clara knew. Then let them notice kindness occasionally. It might improve the castle. A quiet laugh came from the hallway. "Good night, Your Majesty." "Good night." Evelyn waited until Clara's footsteps faded before turning toward the mirror again. She could cross the hallway now. She could knock on Alexander's door and reveal everything. For one moment, she imagined his expression when he saw her without the Moonveil. Surprise would come first. Perhaps admiration after that. The thought left a bitter taste. Why should clear skin earn the warmth that her character had not? Why should this face receive a chance the other had been denied? Evelyn stepped away from the door. If Alexander ever learned the truth, she wanted him to understand the woman before discovering the secret. Outside the window, moonlight covered the inner gardens in silver. Nearly a foot of fresh snow rested along the hedges, and a narrow stone path curved toward a frozen fountain. The garden lay within the castle walls, quiet and protected from the roads beyond. Evelyn had seen it from the corridor earlier. For 7 years, nighttime had been the only part of each day that felt entirely hers. She opened the wardrobe, found a dark wool cloak, and pulled the hood over her chestnut hair. A servant's staircase near her rooms led down to the enclosed garden passage. 2 guards stood near the main courtyard doors, but the inner garden entrance remained open to members of the royal household. Evelyn slipped outside. Cold air touched her clear face, sharp with pine and winter roses. She breathed deeply. No whispers, no staring, no one measuring her worth before she spoke. She followed the snowy path for nearly 50 yards and stopped beside the frozen fountain. Slowly, Evelyn lowered her hood and looked up at the moon. For the first time since entering Blackwood Castle, she smiled without protecting herself. Then a man's voice came from beneath the shadowed stone archway behind her. "I do not believe we have met." Evelyn turned toward the voice, and every trace of freedom she had felt vanished at once. Alexander stood beneath the stone archway, dressed more simply than he had been at the ceremony, though nothing about him looked ordinary. Moonlight caught in his silver-gray eyes as he stepped from the shadows, his black coat dark against the snow. Evelyn pulled her hood forward by instinct, but she knew the movement came too late. He had already seen her face. "No," she said carefully. "I do not believe we have." Alexander approached along the stone path, stopping several feet away. Evelyn waited for recognition. None came. His gaze moved over her features with open curiosity, searching for a memory that did not exist. He had heard Evelyn speak only a handful of times that day, always in crowded rooms beneath music and conversation. Now she kept her voice softer, almost lost beneath the winter wind. "You were not at the wedding," he said. The irony nearly stole her composure. "I was closer than you might think." One eyebrow lifted. "That sounds deliberately mysterious. Perhaps you asked too many questions." For a moment, Alexander simply stared. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Most people are careful about speaking to me that way. Most people probably know who you are. And you do not." Evelyn glanced toward the frozen fountain. "I know you are Alexander Blackwood." His expression sharpened with amusement. "Then you know enough. Enough to be frightened?" The question escaped before caution could stop it. Alexander looked at her differently then. The king disappeared for half a heartbeat, leaving behind a tired man standing outside, because perhaps he needed the same thing she did. "Space." "No," he said. "Not tonight." Wind moved softly through the snow-covered hedges. Evelyn breathed in pine and cold stone. "What should I call you?" Alexander asked. Her real name rose to her lips. She stopped it just in time. "Evie." It was not entirely false. Her mother had called her that when she was young, before Moonveil changed the way strangers looked at her. "Evie," Alexander repeated. Hearing the name in his voice created an unexpected ache. "And why is Evie wandering through my garden after midnight?" Perhaps she wanted silence. "That makes 2 of us." He walked toward the fountain, and Evelyn remained where she was. "Was the wedding really that exhausting?" she asked. Alexander gave her a sideways glance. "You know about it. Everyone in the castle knows about it. Then everyone probably knows what they said about my bride." Evelyn felt her shoulders stiffen beneath the cloak. "People say many things when they believe cruelty will entertain the room." His eyes returned to her. "You defend someone you have never met. Do I need to know her to think she deserves respect?" Alexander had no immediate answer. Evelyn watched that silence settle over him. "You sound as though you dislike me already." "I do not know you well enough to dislike you." "That is strangely comforting." This time he smiled. A real smile. Evelyn stared before she could stop herself. The man at the wedding had seemed carved from winter stone. This man looked almost approachable. Almost. She remembered the lowering sun, the lifted veil, the disappointment he had hidden behind royal discipline. "You should try speaking to your wife," she said. His smile faded. "Perhaps I should." A distant clock began marking the hour. Evelyn pulled her hood higher. She had already stayed too long. "Good night, Alexander." She turned toward the castle. "Evie." She stopped. "Will I see you again?" Evelyn looked back at the man who had barely looked at his wife and was now asking a stranger to return. Perhaps. Then she disappeared through the garden passage, leaving Alexander beside the frozen fountain, watching the doorway long after it had closed. Morning returned the Moonveil before Evelyn opened her curtains. She felt the familiar warmth moving across her cheek in reverse, and when she faced the mirror, the dark markings had settled into place again. For years, that reflection had taught her to prepare for other people's reactions before leaving a room. Today, something else troubled her. Alexander had smiled at Evie. The memory should not have mattered. Instead, it followed her downstairs. She found him already seated at breakfast, a cup of coffee beside his hand, and several letters arranged near his plate. His gray eyes lifted when she entered. "Good morning, Evelyn." "Good morning, Alexander." Nothing in his expression suggested he recognized her. Evelyn sat across from him and accepted tea from Clara. "Did your mother sleep better last night?" she asked. Clara blinked in surprise. The young servant had mentioned her mother's winter illness while leaving the towels outside Evelyn's room. "Yes, Your Majesty. Much better. Thank you for remembering. I am glad." Clara moved away with a small smile. Evelyn reached for her tea and noticed Alexander watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." His gaze dropped to the letters. "You remember people's names quickly. People usually notice when they are treated as though their names matter." Alexander looked up again, but Evelyn had already turned toward the window. Later that morning, she toured the western wing with the household steward. Cold air slipped through old window frames, leaving several servants' rooms barely above 55 degrees. Evelyn requested repairs and additional firewood before asking about winter food supplies for families working on the estate. By noon, the castle had begun whispering about its new queen for reasons that had nothing to do with her face. Alexander heard those whispers from the upper gallery. He also saw Evelyn kneel beside a young Omega boy who had arrived with his father to deliver flour. The child's small wooden wolf had rolled beneath a bench. Evelyn retrieved it, brushed away the dust, and returned it with a smile. Alexander stopped walking. Something about that smile tugged at his memory. Moonlight. A frozen fountain. A woman who had told him to speak to his wife. He dismissed the thought. By evening, however, Alexander reached the moon garden before the castle clock struck 10. He told himself he wanted silence. After 20 minutes beside the frozen fountain, the excuse became difficult to believe. After 40, it became ridiculous. Kings must have remarkable patience. He turned. Evie stood beneath the archway in her dark cloak, her chestnut hair catching the moonlight. Relief crossed Alexander's face before he could hide it. "You came back." I said perhaps. Perhaps is an inconvenient word. Evelyn approached the fountain, but kept several feet between them. Then stopped asking questions with uncertain answers. Alexander almost smiled. "I looked for you today." Her pulse jumped. "Why?" "Because no one in this castle seems to know an Evie." Evelyn forced herself to remain calm. "Perhaps I prefer it that way." Alexander studied her, then looked toward the illuminated castle windows. "My wife surprised me today." Evelyn's breath slowed. "How?" "She spent her morning worrying about cold rooms she will never sleep in and servants most nobles never notice." He paused. "I expected her to arrive wanting influence, jewels, privileges. And instead..." Alexander's gaze returned to her. "Instead, I am beginning to wonder whether I decided who she was before giving her a chance to show me." Alexander's confession should have satisfied her. Instead, Evelyn felt something tighten quietly beneath her ribs. He had finally begun to see his wife, yet he was telling another woman about the discovery. "Perhaps you saw what you expected to see," she said. Alexander looked toward the frozen fountain. Moonlight rested across the ice like a sheet of silver glass. "That is probably true." Evelyn studied him. "You admit that easily. Admitting a mistake is easier than discovering how long you have been making it." The answer surprised her. She folded her hands beneath her cloak, hiding how cold her fingers had become. "Then why did you judge her?" Alexander was silent for several seconds. "The marriage was arranged before I met her. My council wanted stability between our territories. Her family wanted the protection of Blackwood. Everyone spoke as though the decision had already been made." His jaw tightened. "When Evelyn arrived, I treated her as though she represented everything I had not chosen." "Even though she did not choose it either?" Alexander's eyes lifted to hers. "Yes." The honesty landed harder than an excuse would have. Evelyn breathed slowly through the ache. "And when you lifted her veil?" He understood the question immediately. "I was surprised." "That is a careful word. I am trying not to turn honesty into cruelty." Evelyn looked away. Snow clung to the hedges surrounding them, and somewhere beyond the garden wall, a clock marked the late hour. Cruelty does not become kindness simply because no one says it aloud. Alexander went still. For a moment, Evelyn wondered whether she had pushed too far. Then he lowered his gaze. "No, it does not." She had expected defensiveness from a king. His willingness to remain inside the discomfort unsettled her more. If your wife looked different, Evelyn asked, would your marriage feel different? Alexander did not answer. She waited. Wind moved a loose strand of chestnut hair across her cheek. Finally, he said, I do not know. Evelyn swallowed. At least that is honest. You sound disappointed. Perhaps I hoped you would know. Alexander studied her face. Why does my marriage matter so much to you? Her pulse quickened. Because I think your wife deserves to know whether she married a man capable of seeing more than what frightened or disappointed him on the first day. His expression changed. You defend her as though you know her. Maybe I know what it is like to enter a room and realize everyone has already decided what you are worth. Something softened in his eyes. He stepped nearer, but stopped with several feet still between them. Then they were fools. Evelyn almost laughed at the irony. You cannot know that. I know enough to believe it. For one dangerous heartbeat, she wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to watch recognition cross his face and learn whether those words would survive the truth. Instead, she pulled her cloak tighter. You should speak to Evelyn tomorrow. What should I say? Do not say anything impressive. Her smile was faint. Ask her a question and actually listen to the answer. Alexander smiled back. You give orders easily for someone who claims not to know me. Perhaps kings need practice taking them. A quiet laugh escaped him. Then his gaze sharpened. He stared at her smile, as though something inside his memory had shifted. Evelyn's breath caught. Alexander took one slow step closer. That smile. She became perfectly still. What about it? His silver-gray eyes searched hers beneath the moonlight. I saw it today. Today? Evelyn asked, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. Alexander did not look away. In the western corridor, my wife smiled at a young boy after returning his toy. The cold suddenly seemed sharper against Evelyn's face. She gave a small shrug. Perhaps many women smile the same way. Perhaps. He said it without conviction. Then his expression changed again. Alexander drew a slow breath, and Evelyn saw the moment his wolf noticed something his mind had not yet understood. Pine drifted through the garden from the surrounding trees, but beneath it lingered another scent, soft and warm, almost impossible to separate from the winter air. Alexander had noticed it that morning when Evelyn passed his chair at breakfast. He had noticed it again near the western wing. Now it surrounded Evie. What is it? Evelyn asked. Your scent. Her fingers tightened beneath her cloak. My scent. It reminds me of someone. This castle probably uses the same soap in every room. Alexander almost smiled, but his eyes remained focused. Do you always answer questions with explanations prepared that quickly? Only when kings ask strange questions. She stepped away from the fountain. It is late. Alexander did not stop her. That somehow made leaving harder. Good night, Evie. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. Good night, Alexander. She crossed the garden quickly, entered the protected passage, and did not breathe normally again until her bedroom door was locked behind her. By sunrise, the Moonveil had returned. Evelyn dressed in a simple ivory gown and went downstairs determined to behave as though nothing had happened. She found Alexander in the library beside a long table covered with maps and correspondence. Good morning, she said. His head lifted immediately. Good morning, Evelyn. She crossed toward the shelves. Alexander watched her with an attention he had never given her on their wedding day. Clara entered carrying several letters. One envelope slipped from the stack and landed near Evelyn's feet. Evelyn bent to retrieve it at the same moment Alexander stepped forward. Their hands stopped inches apart. Then Alexander inhaled. Evelyn froze. The scent was there again. Faint. Warm. Familiar. His silver-gray eyes rose slowly to hers. What perfume are you wearing? None. None at all. Strong fragrances give me headaches. Evelyn handed the envelope to Clara and straightened. Alexander said nothing, but his wolf stirred with quiet certainty. Same. Scent. Same blue-gray eyes. Same smile. The idea forming in his mind was absurd, yet each detail made it harder to dismiss. That afternoon, Vanessa Whitmore arrived for tea with several court ladies. She greeted Evelyn pleasantly, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the western windows. Tomorrow is the royal moon banquet, Vanessa said. The final toast will take place just after sunset. Naturally, everyone hopes the new queen will remain until the end. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Vanessa could not know the truth, but she had noticed the pattern. Evelyn always disappeared before dark, Of course, Evelyn replied carefully. Across the room, Alexander looked up from a document. He heard the change in Evelyn's heartbeat. He saw the brief tension in her shoulders. Then he looked toward the windows, remembering that Evie never appeared before nightfall. Vanessa smiled. Wonderful. I would hate for anyone to think our queen had something to hide. Evelyn held her gaze without answering. Alexander remained silent as well, but for the first time, he found himself waiting for sunset for an entirely different reason. The royal moon banquet began beneath a winter sky, fading from pale gold to silver, and Evelyn understood the trap before the first course was served. Blackwood Hall had been arranged so the western windows remained completely uncovered, giving every guest a perfect view of the descending sun. Hundreds of candles waited unlit along the walls, ready for darkness. Vanessa had not discovered the Moonveil. Evelyn was certain of that. She had discovered something almost as dangerous. A pattern. Evelyn always disappeared before sunset. Tonight, Vanessa intended to make leaving impossible without attracting attention. Evelyn entered beside Alexander wearing an ivory gown with no veil covering the dark markings across her cheek. Whispers followed her toward the royal table. She ignored them. Alexander did not. His gaze moved once across the room, and several conversations immediately softened. "You do not have to stay for the final toast," he said quietly as he pulled out her chair. Evelyn looked at him. "Vanessa invited half the northern court, specifically to watch whether I leave. I noticed. Then leaving would answer a question she has not earned the right to ask." Alexander glanced toward the windows. "And staying?" Evelyn lowered her voice. "Might answer a different one." His eyes sharpened, but the musicians began playing before he could respond. Dinner passed beneath a tension Evelyn could measure by sunlight. 40 minutes. 30. 20. Vanessa moved through the hall with effortless confidence, greeting nobles and occasionally looking toward Evelyn as though checking a clock. Then Clara approached carrying a tray of ceremonial glasses. Her hands were steady until one of Vanessa's companions stepped backward without looking. Clara shifted quickly to avoid her. A glass tipped, spilling sparkling water across the edge of Vanessa's blue gown. The room went quiet. Clara's face lost its color. "I am so sorry, Lady Whitmore." Vanessa looked down at the damp fabric. "You should be more careful." "It was an accident," Evelyn said. Vanessa turned toward her with a composed smile. "Of course. I will report it to the steward tomorrow and let him decide whether someone this careless belongs in royal service." Clara's breathing changed. Evelyn heard it. "There is nothing to report." Vanessa's smile tightened. "Surely household discipline is beneath the Queen's attention. Fairness is not beneath anyone's attention." Alexander looked from Vanessa to Evelyn, then toward the windows. Less than 10 minutes remained. A faint warmth had already begun beneath Evelyn's skin. Her body knew the sunset better than any clock. Vanessa gestured toward the royal table. "The final toast will begin shortly. Perhaps your majesty should return to your seat." Evelyn saw the calculation behind her courtesy. "Stay, and something happens. Leave, and everyone wonders why." Alexander rose. "Evelyn." His voice was low. "You may retire if you wish." He was giving her an escape without demanding an explanation. Evelyn almost accepted it. Then Clara whispered, "Please go, Your Majesty. I will be fine." Evelyn looked at the young servant's trembling hands. She knew that sentence. She had spoken versions of it herself for years. Whenever protecting someone else from discomfort seemed easier than admitting she was hurt. Outside, the sun touched the snowy hills. 5 minutes. Perhaps less. Evelyn slowly removed her hand from the back of her chair. "No." Alexander studied her. "Are you certain?" The warmth spread toward her temple. Evelyn stepped away from the royal table and moved beside Clara. Vanessa's confident expression flickered. "Clara stays," Evelyn said. "And so do I." Through the western windows, the final band of sunlight narrowed against the horizon. "Then let them look at me." Evelyn's voice was quiet, yet it carried through the banquet hall with enough certainty to silence the nearest tables. Clara turned toward her, frightened. Vanessa's polished smile faded at the edges. Alexander remained standing beside the royal table, his silver-gray eyes fixed on Evelyn as the final strip of sunlight narrowed across the floor. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you do not owe anyone in this room an explanation." The word surprised her. Only days ago, he had been one of the people whose judgment she feared most. Now he was offering her a way out without even knowing what he was protecting. For one fragile moment, she wanted to take it. Then Clara whispered, "Please, Your Majesty. I will be all right." Evelyn looked at the young servant. Her hand still trembled around the tray. That is what people say when they are accustomed to being left alone with someone else's judgment. Evelyn gently took the tray from Clara and placed it on the nearest table. Vanessa drew herself straighter. "This has become unnecessarily dramatic. I merely said the steward should review her mistake. Then he can review the facts," Evelyn replied. Clara moved because another guest stepped into her path. She prevented the entire tray from falling. One glass spilled. "That is not carelessness." A murmur traveled through the room. Vanessa glanced toward Alexander, perhaps expecting royal support. None came. Alexander stepped down from the dais. "The queen is correct. There will be no complaint against Clara." Relief flashed across the servant's face. Vanessa lowered her gaze. "Of course, Your Majesty." Evelyn should have felt safe then. Instead, warmth spread beneath the Moonveil markings near her temple. She turned slightly toward the western windows. The sun was almost gone. Alexander noticed. "Come with me," he said under his breath. "Now." Evelyn looked at him. There was no command in his expression, only concern and a question he had not yet dared to ask. "If I leave now, everyone will believe Vanessa was right to make this about me. I do not care what they believe." "I do." Alexander frowned. Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not because I need their approval. Because Clara needs to know that defending her was not something I was willing to do only while it remained convenient." Alexander looked at Clara, then back at Evelyn. Something shifted in his face. Respect arrived quietly, without the fascination he had shown Evie beneath the moon. Evelyn realized that mattered more than she wanted it to. "If keeping my dignity requires abandoning someone weaker than me," she said, "then I never had dignity at all." Alexander went completely still. The final sunlight touched Evelyn's marked cheek. Beyond the windows, the edge of the sun disappeared behind the snowy hills. Warmth swept across her skin. A woman near the front of the hall gasped. Evelyn closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, but refused to turn away. The dark markings began fading from her temple, softening slowly along her cheek. Silence spread outward until even the musicians stopped. When Evelyn opened her eyes again, Alexander was staring at her. Not at the transformation alone. At her eyes. Blue-gray beneath candlelight. The same eyes that had challenged him beside the frozen fountain. Then came the scent, warm and familiar beneath pine and winter roses. His wolf recognized it instantly. Alexander's breath caught. Every impossible detail suddenly aligned. The smile, the voice, the questions, the woman who defended his wife as though every insult belonged to her. Evelyn watched recognition move across his face. Alexander whispered the name only one person in Blackwood Castle knew. "Evie, Evie." Alexander said the name again, and this time it sounded less like a question than a truth he could not believe he had missed. Evelyn stood beneath the chandeliers while hundreds of eyes moved over the face the court had never seen. The last traces of the Moonveil disappeared from her cheek, leaving clear pale skin beneath the candlelight. Whispers rose around the hall. Evelyn heard words like magic, enchantment, impossible, beautiful, but none of them mattered. She watched only Alexander. His expression held astonishment, but beneath it she saw something more painful. Memory. He was rebuilding every conversation in the moon garden and finally understanding that the stranger who had challenged him, listened to him, and defended his wife had been his wife all along. "It was you," he said. Evelyn lifted her chin. "Yes." Alexander stepped toward her, then stopped several feet away as though he understood that closeness was not his to claim. "Every night in the garden?" "Yes." "Why did you not tell me?" The question was quiet, almost wounded. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in hearing it. "When should I have told you?" "At the wedding, after you lifted my veil and could barely hide your disappointment? At dinner, while half the court whispered about the bride you had been forced to accept? Or perhaps after you gave me a room across the hall so there would be no confusion about what our marriage meant?" Alexander lowered his eyes. No defense came. Vanessa stepped forward from the gathered nobles. "Your Majesty, surely the court deserves to know what kind of magic this is." Alexander turned toward her. "No." The single word stopped the room. "This is Evelyn's truth. She will explain it if and when she chooses." Vanessa fell silent. Evelyn looked at Alexander with surprise. He did not reach for her. He did not announce that everything had changed now that her face had changed. Instead, he faced the guests. The banquet is over. Within minutes, the great hall began emptying beneath a storm of restrained whispers. Clara passed Evelyn and offered a grateful look before following the other servants. When the doors finally closed, Alexander and Evelyn remained several yards apart beneath the fading candles. The Moonveil began when I was 16, Evelyn said. At sunrise, the markings return. At sunset, they disappear. Healers have examined me for 7 years. No one knows why. Alexander listened without interrupting. And Evie? My mother called me that when I was young. His eyes closed briefly. So you never invented another person? No, you did. Alexander looked at her. The words landed exactly as she intended. You treated Evelyn like an obligation and Evie like someone worth knowing. I never asked you to do either. Shame crossed his face. You are right. Evelyn had prepared herself for excuses. His agreement left her with nowhere to place her anger. Alexander took a breath. I owe you an apology. You owe me more than words. Then I will not ask words to fix it. He stepped aside, leaving the path to the door completely open. Evelyn started toward it, but stopped after several steps. One question had followed her from the first night in the garden, and now she needed the answer even if it hurt. She turned. Alexander was still watching her, and the warmth in his eyes was unmistakable now. That made the question harder. Would you be looking at me like this if the sun were still up? Silence filled the hall. Alexander's expression changed. The wonder disappeared first, then certainty. He looked toward the dark western windows, understanding what she was truly asking. Evelyn waited, but he did not offer an easy answer. Finally, Alexander lowered his gaze. For the first time since she had met him, the Alpha King looked ashamed of the man he had been only hours before. Alexander did not answer immediately, and Evelyn was grateful he did not insult her with something beautiful and false. The last guests disappeared beyond the great doors, leaving only the fading candlelight and the distant sound of servants clearing the adjoining rooms. I do not know, he finally said. Evelyn felt the answer settle inside her. It hurt, but not as deeply as a lie would have. Thank you for telling me the truth. She turned toward the door. Evelyn. She stopped. I cannot change what I thought when I first saw you, Alexander said. And I cannot pretend I understood you before tonight. His voice remained steady, stripped of royal certainty. But I can decide what I do now that I understand how wrong I was. Evelyn looked over her shoulder. Words are easy for kings. Then do not believe mine. He stepped away from her path. Watch what I do. Evelyn returned to her rooms alone. By sunrise, the familiar warmth moved across her face, and the Moonveil markings slowly returned. She stood before the mirror without covering them. For years, sunrise had felt like a door closing. That morning, she simply tied back her chestnut hair and went downstairs. Clara waited outside with breakfast tea. Her eyes widened for an instant, then softened into the same grateful smile she had worn the night before. Good morning, Your Majesty. No hesitation. No disappointment. Evelyn smiled. Good morning, Clara. As they walked through the western corridor, Evelyn noticed carpenters already examining the old window frames. Fresh firewood had been stacked near the servants' entrance, and the household steward was speaking with 2 workers about repairing the cold rooms. Did you arrange this? Evelyn asked Clara. No, Your Majesty. The king ordered it before breakfast. Evelyn said nothing. Near the main staircase, another notice had been posted. Household servants would no longer face public disciplinary discussions for ordinary mistakes. Complaints would be reviewed privately by the steward, with circumstances considered before any decision. Again, Alexander had said nothing to her. He had simply acted. Evelyn found him later in the council chamber. Vanessa and several senior nobles were already present. The Queen's condition raises questions, one councilman was saying. The court will expect an explanation. Alexander saw Evelyn enter. His gaze rested on the dark markings covering her cheek. It did not move away. The Queen's face is not a matter for public examination, he said. Vanessa folded her hands. Surely the crown must consider appearances. Alexander's expression cooled. Yesterday, while much of this court was concerned with appearances, Evelyn was concerned with whether a servant was being treated fairly. I noticed the difference. Silence followed. Evelyn remained near the doorway. Alexander continued. I judged my wife before I knew her. That failure belongs to me, not to her." Vanessa stared at him. The council members shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn felt something loosen inside her, though she refused to call it forgiveness. Not yet. Alexander walked around the table but stopped several feet from her. "I will not ask you to trust me because I finally learned something I should have understood from the beginning." Evelyn searched his face. "Then what are you asking?" "Nothing." His answer surprised her. Trust should not be requested before it is earned. He turned toward the steward. "Tomorrow morning, assemble the full court in the great hall at sunrise." Vanessa's expression brightened slightly, perhaps imagining some formal judgment of the queen's secret. Evelyn knew better. Alexander looked toward her, then toward the eastern windows where morning light illuminated every Moonveil marking she carried. In that moment, she understood exactly why he had chosen sunrise instead of sunset. The great hall filled before the sun cleared the eastern hills. Nobles stood beneath Blackwood's silver banners, council members gathered near the royal dais, and servants remained quietly along the walls. No musicians played. No banquet tables softened the room with celebration. Evelyn waited outside the open doors while morning light slowly strengthened across the castle floor. She wore a simple ivory gown and no veil. The Moonveil markings curved clearly across her pale cheek. Clara stood nearby. "You do not have to be afraid," Clara whispered. Evelyn looked toward the crowded hall. "I spent 7 years being afraid of rooms like this." She drew a slow breath. "I think I am finished." Then she walked inside. Conversations faded one by one. Evelyn could feel every gaze following her, but she did not lower her head. At the far end of the hall, Alexander stood before the royal dais in his formal black coat. Vanessa waited among the nobles, watching with careful interest. Evelyn crossed the marble floor until she stopped several feet from Alexander. "You summoned the court?" "Yes." His eyes rested directly on hers. "Why?" Before Alexander could answer, Vanessa stepped forward. "Perhaps everyone should wait until tonight. If the queen's condition is being discussed, surely the court deserves to witness both appearances." Alexander turned toward her. "There are not two queens." Vanessa's expression faltered. "I only meant that after sunset she becomes Evelyn." His voice remained calm. "Just as she is Evelyn now." Silence settled over the hall. Alexander faced the gathered court. "When my wife arrived at Blackwood, many people judged her before hearing her speak. I was among them." Evelyn's breath caught. Kings could apologize privately and preserve their pride. Alexander had chosen witnesses. "I told myself that because I did not insult her openly, my judgment was somehow less cruel. It was not." He stepped down from the dais. "While I was concerned with a marriage I had not chosen, Evelyn noticed servants sleeping in cold rooms. She learned their names. She defended someone who had no power to protect her own position. And when protecting that servant threatened the secret Evelyn had carried for 7 years, she stayed." Alexander stopped beside her rather than in front of her. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating every dark marking across Evelyn's cheek. Those things were true before sunset. They were true after sunset. They are true now. Evelyn looked at him. Nothing in his expression searched for the face he had seen beneath moonlight. He was looking at the woman standing beside him in daylight. Alexander extended his hand, but left several inches between them. He did not take hers. He waited. The choice was hers. Evelyn stared at his open palm. At their wedding, he had offered his hand because tradition demanded it. This was different. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Alexander closed his fingers gently around hers and faced the court. "Evelyn Carter is my wife and your queen. Her dignity does not begin at sunset, and her worth does not disappear at sunrise." No one moved. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Evelyn felt the warmth of Alexander's hand around hers. "You waited until morning," she whispered. "Yes." "Why?" Alexander turned toward her. His voice dropped until the answer belonged almost entirely to them. "Because I needed you to know that I was not choosing the woman from the garden." Evelyn's heart tightened. Alexander held her gaze. "I am choosing the woman who stood beside Clara when walking away would have been easier. The woman who challenged me when I deserved it. The woman I should have seen from the beginning." Evelyn felt something inside her finally loosen. Not every wound disappeared. Trust did not return because a king made one beautiful speech. But for the first time, she could imagine it returning at all. Alexander gave her hand the slightest reassuring pressure. Beyond the eastern windows, the sun rose higher over Blackwood, and Evelyn did not wish for darkness. By evening, the story of what happened at sunrise had traveled through every corridor of Blackwood Castle, but Evelyn no longer cared how the court chose to tell it. She spent the day doing what she had done before anyone knew her secret. She reviewed the repairs in the western wing, spoke with the steward about winter supplies, and stopped in the kitchen long enough to ask Clara about her mother. Nothing about those ordinary moments felt ordinary anymore. Servants met Evelyn's eyes instead of quickly looking away. Nobles who had once studied the markings on her cheek now seemed uncertain where to look. Evelyn discovered she preferred their uncertainty to their pity. Alexander did not follow her through the castle seeking gratitude. He returned to council meetings, answered correspondence, and gave her space. That mattered. Near sunset, Evelyn found herself walking toward the moon garden. Snow covered the hedges in soft white layers, and the frozen fountain waited beneath a sky turning lavender over the western hills. She stood beside it as the final sunlight touched her face. Footsteps sounded behind her. 40 minutes early, she said without turning. Alexander stopped beside the path. I am improving. Evelyn smiled. You once waited 40 minutes for Evie. I remember. He approached, but remained several feet away. The distance was deliberate now, not cold. Evelyn appreciated that too. Together they watched the sun descend. The familiar warmth began beneath her skin. The Moonveil markings slowly softened along her cheek and disappeared as daylight surrendered to evening. Alexander watched the transformation without surprise. When it was finished, his expression remained exactly the same. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Nothing. Were you expecting applause? The court nearly forgot how to breathe last night. The court is easily impressed. A quiet laugh escaped her. For a moment, they simply stood beneath the deepening blue sky. Then Evelyn asked the question she had avoided since sunrise. Which version do you prefer? Alexander's smile disappeared. He considered her carefully. Neither. Evelyn stared at him. That might be the worst answer you have given me. You did not let me finish. He looked toward the frozen fountain. I prefer the woman who caught a falling glass before asking whether anyone important was watching. The woman who remembered Clara's name. The woman who noticed cold rooms in a castle full of warm ones. The woman who stayed when leaving would have protected her secret. His eyes returned to hers. I prefer Evelyn. Something inside her chest tightened, then softened. Even tomorrow morning? She asked. Especially tomorrow morning, because that is when you will probably test whether I meant any of this. Evelyn laughed again, warmer this time. Alexander extended his hand, but as he had at sunrise, he waited. He did not assume forgiveness. He did not assume affection. He simply offered. Evelyn looked at his open palm before placing her gloved hand in his. They began walking along the snowy path, leaving two parallel trails behind them. Do you want to break the Moonveil? Alexander asked. Evelyn considered it. I used to want that more than anything. And now I want the choice to be mine. Alexander nodded. Then it is. No promise to save her. No declaration that she needed fixing. Just acceptance. Above Blackwood Castle, the first stars appeared. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and the dark markings would return. Perhaps someday a healer would understand the Moonveil. Perhaps no one ever would. Evelyn realized the answer no longer frightened her. For 7 years, she had measured freedom by the distance between sunset and sunrise. Now she walked beside Alexander beneath the winter moon, her hand resting willingly in his, knowing morning could come whenever it wished. The world might still change the way it looked at her when daylight returned. Alexander did not. And for the first time in 7 years, Evelyn was no longer afraid of sunrise.